The millionaire disguised herself as a waitress to meet her fiancé and his parents. The way she was treated left her feeling betrayed and with a shattered soul. Sarah Montgomery gazed out the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office. The Manhattan skyline spread before her like a kingdom of glass and steel. 50 stories below, tiny figures hurried through the streets, oblivious to her watchful eye. That's how she preferred things these days. Observing from a distance, analyzing, calculating, never getting too close. The projections for the Singapore property exceeded expectations by 17%, she said without turning around behind her. Her assistant Olivia shifted nervously, the subtle rustle of papers betraying her discomfort. Yes, Miss Montgomery, the board is quite pleased. Sarah finally turned, her sleek black designer dress catching the afternoon light. At 38, she possessed the kind of beauty that intimidated rather than invited. Sharp cheekbones, piercing blue eyes, and dark hair pulled back in an immaculate bun, not a strand out of place, not a hint of weakness visible. Pleased is irrelevant. I want them ecstatic, Sarah replied, moving to her desk where a stack of quarterly reports awaited her signature. What else? Olivia cleared her throat. Your Aunt Margaret called again? She insists on seeing you this evening. Sarah's pen paused over a document. Aunt Margaret never insisted, unless something significant was afoot, 5 years ago, after the private jet carrying Sarah's parents crashed into the Atlantic. Margaret had been the one to insist Sarah take only 3 days to grieve before addressing the shareholders. The Montgomery empire waits for no one, she'd said, her voice firm but not unkind. Not even death. Fine. Have James bring the car around at 7, after Olivia left. Sarah allowed herself a moment of weakness. She opened her desk drawer and removed a silver-framed photograph, the only personal item in her ruthlessly efficient workspace. Her parents smiled back at her, standing proudly in front of the first Montgomery Grand Hotel. They looked young, hopeful, blissfully unaware that their empire would one day become their daughter's gilded cage. What would you do? She whispered to the photo, something she'd never allow herself in front of others. The question hung in the air. Unanswered as always, Aunt Margaret's Upper East Side townhouse remained unchanged since Sarah was a child. A shrine to old money with its antique furniture, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and the perpetual scent of lemon polish and expensive perfume. You're working too much, Margaret said by way of greeting, her keen eyes assessing Sarah as a jeweler might examine a diamond for flaws. At 72, Margaret Montgomery Pierce remained formidable. Her silver hair swept into an elegant updo, her posture ramrod straight. The Shaw acquisition is complex. The numbers require... I didn't invite you here to discuss numbers, Margaret interrupted, gesturing Sarah toward the sitting room. Brandy? No, thank you. Sarah sat primly on the edge of an antique settee. What's this about, Aunt Margaret? The older woman poured herself a generous measure of amber liquid before settling into her favorite wingback chair. The board is concerned. About what? Profits are up 22% year over year. The Shanghai property opens next month, ahead of schedule and under budget. About you, dear. Margaret's voice softened slightly. 5 years, Sarah. 5 years of nothing but work. No relationships, no social life, not even a vacation. Sarah stiffened. I don't see how my personal life is the board's concern. Everything about the Montgomery heir is the board's concern, especially when that heir refuses to consider the succession plan. I'm 38, not 88. Margaret sipped her brandy. Your father was younger than you when he married your mother and wrote his first will. The room fell silent, save for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, ever since Alexander Porter had betrayed her 3 years ago, sleeping with her while secretly negotiating to sell company secrets to her biggest competitor. She'd locked away any desire for companionship. I assume you have a proposal, Sarah finally said, knowing her aunt never presented problems without solutions. Margaret reached for a slim folder on the side table. The Carter family. The Vineyard people. Sarah frowned. Much more than vineyards. Restaurants, boutique hotels along the West Coast, a respected name in the industry. Old money, good breeding. Sarah took the folder reluctantly. Inside was a photograph of an attractive man in his early 40s with sandy hair and a practiced smile. Ethan Carter, she read aloud. Their son, 40 years old, Harvard Business School, currently managing their East Coast expansion. Margaret paused. They're facing some financial difficulties due to poor investments in Europe. Nothing catastrophic, but concerning. Understanding dawned on Sarah. So they want a Montgomery bailout wrapped in a wedding dress. And we want stability, continuity, and eventually, an heir to the Montgomery legacy. A mutually beneficial arrangement. Sarah stared at Ethan's photo, trying to imagine herself walking down an aisle toward this stranger, pledging her life to someone she didn't know, didn't love, but hadn't her own parents started similarly, an arrangement that had blossomed into genuine affection and respect. Have they agreed to this proposition? In principle, Richard Carter and I have had preliminary discussions. Sarah's jaw tightened. You approached them before speaking to me. I tested the waters. Nothing more. Margaret leaned forward. Sarah, you've built walls so high even you can't see over them anymore. Your parents wouldn't have wanted this for you, an empire, but no life to enjoy it. Sarah closed the folder, her mind already calculating angles, assessing risks. I'll consider it. The Carters are hosting a charity gala next month. They expect you to attend. I have the Tokyo meetings. Reschedule them. Margaret cut in firmly. This is important, Sarah. More important than another hotel. After leaving her aunt's home, Sarah directed her driver to take the long way back to her penthouse. As the car glided through the glittering Manhattan night, she found herself studying the couples on the sidewalks, holding hands, laughing, sharing umbrellas against a light drizzle that had begun to fall. When had she last laughed like that? When had she last touched another person with anything other than a businesslike handshake? Later that night, Sarah sat alone in her penthouse with a glass of wine she barely tasted. She opened her laptop and typed Ethan Carter into the search bar. Dozens of images appeared. Ethan at charity functions, Ethan on yachts, Ethan with a series of beautiful women on his arm. Something about his smile seemed rehearsed, his eyes never quite matching the upward curve of his lips. Perhaps she was projecting. Perhaps after Alexander, she saw deception everywhere. Sarah closed the laptop and walked to the window. The city sparkled below, millions of lives intersecting while she remained apart. Above it all, yet somehow beneath its weight. She had built the Montgomery empire into something even her father would envy. But Margaret was right about one thing. What was the point of an empire with no one to share it? Sarah made her decision then, though not the one her aunt expected. She would meet this Ethan Carter. But on her terms, she would discover his true nature before committing her life and fortune to a stranger. A plan began to form in her mind, outrageous yet oddly perfect. If Ethan Carter had never met Sarah Montgomery in person, never seen beyond the Forbes profile photos and business magazine covers, for the first time in years, Sarah Montgomery smiled a genuine smile. She would become someone else entirely, someone invisible, someone who could observe the Carters in their natural habitat. She would learn the truth before she ever stepped into their world as herself. The Montgomery empire could wait. Sarah had a different kind of acquisition to plan. The exclusive salon was tucked away on the top floor of a nondescript building in Brooklyn, far from the Manhattan circles where Sarah might be recognized. The discreet sign simply read, "Transformation" in elegant script. No photographs allowed, no social media presence, and a clientele that paid handsomely for anonymity. "We'll start with your hair," said Pascal, the salon's owner, circling Sarah like an artist contemplating a blank canvas. "Everything about you screams, power executive. We need to make you forgettable." Sarah met her own reflection in the mirror. Her dark hair, her most recognizable feature, had remained essentially unchanged since college. Sleek, shoulder length, and perfectly maintained. The thought of altering it made her stomach tighten. "Do whatever's necessary," she said, forcing confidence into her voice. For the next 3 hours, Sarah endured more physical changes than she'd made in the past decade. Pascal cut her hair into a shaggy bob, then applied color that transformed her striking raven locks to a mousy light brown with subtle highlights. The stylist had insisted on dirty blonde, arguing it was the most forgettable hair color, but Sarah had drawn the line there. Even undercover, there were limits. "Now for the makeup lesson," Pascal said, pulling out a tray of cosmetics entirely unlike the high-end products Sarah typically used. "You need to look like someone who gets ready in 15 minutes before rushing to catch the subway." Sarah's transformation extended beyond the salon. She spent 2 days shopping in discount stores, building a wardrobe of serviceable but unremarkable clothing, jeans that weren't quite the right fit, blouses with outdated patterns, and sensible shoes that made her wince when she tried them on. The final touch was a pair of non-prescription glasses with slightly oversized frames. When she finally stood before the full-length mirror in her penthouse, dressed in her new identity, Sarah barely recognized herself. The confident, intimidating CEO had vanished, replaced by a woman who could blend into any crowd, whose gaze people would slide past without a second thought. "Lily," she said to her reflection, testing the name she'd chosen, Lily Adams. The backstory she'd crafted was simple enough to remember. A 29-year-old community college graduate, she couldn't resist shaving nearly a decade off her age, with a spotty employment history, recently moved to New York after a breakup, desperate for work, short on references, exactly the kind of person who might take any job available, including waitressing at Carter's, the family's flagship restaurant in Manhattan. The next phase of her plan was trickier. Sarah needed a stand-in, someone who could play Sarah Montgomery at the necessary meetings and functions while she was living as Lily. Someone trustworthy who understood the gravity of what she was asking. "You want me to do what?" Jessica Parker stared at Sarah from across the penthouse living room, her expression cycling through disbelief, amusement, and alarm. Sarah had chosen Jessica carefully. They'd been roommates at Wharton before Jessica left the corporate world to become an ethics professor. They were similar enough in appearance, both tall, slim brunettes, though Jessica was a few years younger. "Impersonate me at a handful of functions, mostly just meetings with the board where you'll deliver pre-written statements, nothing requiring actual decisions. That's insane and probably illegal." "It's a gray area," Sarah replied. "I'm not asking you to sign anything or access sensitive information." Jessica leaned forward. "Why are you doing this, really?" Sarah hesitated. Jessica was perhaps the only person who knew about Alexander's betrayal, the only one who had seen Sarah cry when the engagement imploded and the scandal threatened to become public. "The board wants me to marry into the Carter family, a merger of dynasties." Sarah kept her voice matter of fact. "I need to know who these people really are before I commit my life to them. And you think working as a waitress will tell you that? People reveal their true character in how they treat those they consider beneath them." Sarah thought of her father, who had always known the names of every housekeeper, driver, and intern. "I need to see who Ethan Carter is when he doesn't think Sarah Montgomery is watching." Jessica studied her for a long moment. "You're serious about this? I'll pay you, of course. Whatever your university salary is for the semester, plus expenses. This isn't about money, Sarah. It's about whether you've lost your mind." Jessica sighed. "What happens when they want to meet the real Sarah Montgomery? I've arranged to be traveling for most of the next month. Video conferences only, which you'll handle from here. If they push for an in-person meeting, you'll attend as me, keep it brief, and defer any serious discussions until I return from my international commitments," against her better judgment. Jessica agreed, though not without extracting a promise that the charade would last no longer than 3 months. The hardest part came next, convincing the board and, more importantly, Aunt Margaret, that Sarah's sudden obsession with the company's international properties required her immediate and extensive personal attention. Tokyo, Singapore, Dubai, and London, all in 1 month. Margaret's voice crackled with suspicion over the phone. "This is about the Carters, isn't it? This is about securing our global position," Sarah countered smoothly. "If I'm to consider joining forces with another family, I need to ensure our foundation is solid. The board won't like this delay. The board will appreciate my thoroughness when the time comes." Sarah projected confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I've arranged for Jessica Parker to represent me at the necessary functions." "You remember Jessica?" A long pause followed. "I remember she was always the reasonable one between you two." Sarah smiled despite herself. "She'll keep things running smoothly. I'll be available by video for anything urgent." Margaret finally relented, though her parting words lingered uncomfortably. "Don't think I don't know what you're doing, Sarah. You can't vet a husband like you do a corporate acquisition." If only you knew, Sarah thought. The final step was securing employment at Carter's. This proved surprisingly challenging, not because the position was coveted, but because Lily Adams had a deliberately thin resume, After being rejected twice, Sarah swallowed her pride and applied for a dishwashing position, reasoning she could work her way up to server. To her surprise, the manager hired her on the spot as a waitress. "We're short-staffed," he explained with a harried look. "The Carters can be demanding. Staff turnover is high." Already learning something useful, Sarah thought, the night before her first shift. Sarah stood in the modest studio apartment she'd rented in Queens under her new identity. The space was a stark contrast to her penthouse. Small, plainly furnished, with neighbors whose conversations filtered through the thin walls. She'd chosen it precisely for this authenticity. She practiced her new walk, less confident. Her new voice, slightly higher, with none of the authoritative tone she'd cultivated. And her new mannerisms, more fidgeting, less direct eye contact. She'd researched common menu items at Carter's and memorized wine pairings. She'd even practiced carrying trays stacked with dishes, breaking 2 plates in the process, as she set the alarm for 5:30 a.m., a full 3 hours earlier than she typically woke. Sarah felt a strange mix of anxiety and exhilaration for the first time in years. She was stepping into unknown territory with no safety net, no team of advisors, no family name to smooth her path. Tomorrow, Sarah Montgomery would disappear, and Lily Adams would begin her mission to uncover the truth about the Carters. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself smiling as she turned out the light. Table 12 is still waiting for their appetizers, and Mr. Carter doesn't like to be kept waiting. Lily, as Sarah now thought of herself while in character, nodded apologetically to Vera. The stern-faced floor manager, after a week at Carter's, she'd learned that Mr. Carter could refer to either Richard, the family patriarch, or Ethan, the supposed bachelor prize. Both were frequent fixtures at the restaurant. Both were equally impatient. And both made the staff tense up whenever they entered the building. "I'll check on their order right away," Lily mumbled, rushing toward the kitchen. She pushed through the swinging doors, immediately assaulted by the cacophony of shouted orders, clanging pots, and the sizzle of meat hitting hot surfaces. "Where are the scallops for 12? She called out, trying to keep her voice from sounding too commanding. Sarah Montgomery might demand answers, but Lily Adams had to request them. "Waiting on chef's approval," replied a line cook, not bothering to look up from the vegetables he was artfully arranging. That meant waiting on Michael Winters, the head chef. Lily scanned the bustling kitchen and spotted him at the pass, meticulously inspecting each plate before allowing it to leave his domain. Unlike most of the Carter's staff, Michael didn't look harried or fearful. His movements were deliberate, his expression intense but calm, like a conductor leading an orchestra through a complex symphony. He caught her eye and nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement that he understood her urgency. There was something about his steady gaze that made Lily feel momentarily seen, not as a waitress or as Sarah Montgomery, but simply as a human being worthy of respect. The feeling vanished when the kitchen doors burst open and Richard Carter stormed in, his expensive suit incongruous amid the white chef coats. "What is the holdup with my table?" he demanded, voice cutting through the kitchen noise like a sharpened blade. "Do you think my guests enjoy staring at empty place settings while their drinks get warm?" The kitchen fell silent. Even the sizzling pans seemed to quiet in deference to Richard's anger. Michael stepped forward, wiping his hands on his apron. "Mr. Carter, I just approved the scallops. They'll be out in 30 seconds. "That's 30 seconds too long," Richard snapped. His gaze swept the kitchen, landing on a young prep cook who'd frozen in place, knife hovering above a half-chopped onion. "You, what's your name?" "To Tony, sir," the boy stammered. "Well, to Tony," Richard mocked. "Since you've clearly got time to stand around like a statue, perhaps you should find employment elsewhere. Clear out your things." The kitchen remained silent as the color drained from Tony's face. "Mr. Carter," Michael interjected calmly. "Tony's one of our best prep cooks. The delay was my call. The first batch of scallops wasn't up to standard." Richard turned his cold gaze to Michael. For a moment, Lily thought he might fire the head chef too. Instead, Richard's lips twisted into something approximating a smile. "Always the defender of the weak, aren't you, Winters?" He turned to leave, but not before adding, "Fine, the boy stays, but I want those scallops at my table before I count to 10. The kitchen erupted into frenetic activity the moment he left. Michael quickly inspected the scallop plates and handed them to Lily. Better hurry, he said quietly, as she pushed through the doors, balancing the heavy tray with more confidence than she'd had a week ago. Lily caught a glimpse of Tony's grateful look toward Michael. It was a small moment, but it told her volumes about the power dynamics in this restaurant. The Carter family occupied the best table in the house, a round booth with a perfect view of both the dining room and the entrance, ensuring they could see everyone while being seen. Richard sat at the center, his wife Catherine to his right, her blonde hair pulled into a severe chignon that accentuated her aristocratic features. Ethan lounged to Richard's left, looking bored despite the attractive brunette pressed against his side. Not his usual date, Lily noted, having seen him with a redhead just 2 nights ago. Finally, Catherine sniffed as Lily set down the appetizers. I was beginning to think we'd been forgotten. I apologize for the wait, ma'am, Lily said, keeping her eyes appropriately downcast. Chef wanted to ensure everything was perfect. Chef should ensure his timing is perfect, Richard grumbled, though his irritation seemed to have diminished after his kitchen display of authority. As Lily arranged the plates, she heard Ethan murmur something to his companion that made her giggle and slap his arm playfully. Lily resisted the urge to lean closer and listen. More wine, Catherine commanded, barely glancing at Lily. Right away, Mrs. Carter. As Lily retreated to fetch the wine, she heard Ethan say something about the Montgomery merger that made Richard hush him sharply. She slowed her pace just enough to catch Ethan's response. Oh, please, Dad. It's not like anyone here knows or cares about my impending doom. The brunette beside him pouted. You never told me you were getting married. Ethan's laugh was cold. Not by choice. Sweetheart, just business. Dad's brilliant plan to save the family fortune. Lily's hand tightened around the wine bottle as she returned. She poured with practiced precision, though her mind was racing. This was exactly the kind of information she'd come for. Will there be anything else? She asked, the model of servile attention. Catherine waved her away without a word, as Lily stepped back from the table. Ethan's eyes flickered over her, not with interest, but with the casual assessment one might give a piece of furniture. It was a look that saw her uniform but not her face, her function, but not her humanity. Over the next week, Lily developed a system. She volunteered for extra shifts whenever she knew the Carters would be dining in, positioned herself near their regular table when possible, and kept her ears open while making herself as forgettable as possible. The picture that emerged wasn't flattering. Richard treated the staff like disposable resources. Catherine pinched pennies despite their apparent wealth, arguing over the bill and leaving insulting tips. But it was Ethan who truly revealed his character when he thought no one important was listening. The Montgomery Ice Queen, he called Sarah over drinks with his friends one evening. Probably hasn't let a man touch her since that finance guy tried to sell her secrets. The board must be desperate to marry her off before her eggs completely dry up. His friends had laughed, clinking glasses in a toast to Ethan's sacrifice for the family. At least she's hot in that frigid way, one friend consoled him. And loaded. Think of all the fun you can have with Montgomery money. Ethan's smile had turned predatory then. Oh, I'm counting on it. I've got debts that need settling, and Montgomery hotels have the perfect cure for what ails me. Lily had nearly dropped her tray at that. Later, in the quiet of the employee bathroom, she'd stared at her reflection, the mousy hair, the forgettable clothes, and felt a surge of vindication. This was exactly why she'd undertaken this charade. Better to discover Ethan's true nature now than after saying I do, the most surprising revelation. However, wasn't about the Carters, but about the staff's unanimous respect for Michael Winters. In a workplace ruled by fear and resentment, Michael was the exception, demanding excellence but never belittling, defending his team from the Carters' worst excesses, treating everyone from dishwashers to sommeliers with the same quiet dignity. He could work anywhere, Lisa, another waitress, told Lily during a rare quiet moment. Michelin-starred places have tried to poach him for years. No one understands why he stays with the Carters. Maybe they pay him really well, Lily suggested. Lisa shook her head. It's something else. Something personal. He wears that St. Christopher medal like it's keeping him alive. Never takes it off, not even in the hottest kitchen rush. Lily's curiosity about Michael grew alongside her disgust for the Carters. While she'd come to investigate her potential fiancé, She found herself increasingly drawn to the mystery of the quiet chef, with the watchful eyes and the protective instinct toward his staff. On her 15th day at Carter's, as Lily was finishing her shift, she overheard Ethan in a heated phone conversation in the restaurant's back hallway. "Of course I'm not backing out," he was saying, voice low but intense. "Do you think I want to marry the Ice Queen? But Dad's right. We need Montgomery money before the creditors start circling." No, she suspects nothing. Her representative hasn't asked a single intelligent question about our financials. Yes, I'll handle her once the merger's complete, once I have access to those accounts. He stopped abruptly as Lily rounded the corner, her heart pounding in her ears. For a terrible moment, she thought he might recognize something in her face, some echo of Sarah Montgomery beneath the disguise. Instead, he merely frowned at the interruption. "Staff aren't allowed in this hallway," he snapped, covering the phone. "Sorry, sir," Lily mumbled, hurrying past with her head down. Behind her, she heard him resume. "Just some waitress. No one important." Those words, "no one important," echoed in her mind as she changed out of her uniform in the cramped staff locker room. If only he knew who was serving his wine, hearing his schemes, witnessing his true character. Sarah Montgomery might not be important to Ethan Carter, but she was about to become very important indeed. "You're getting better at this," Michael commented as Lily successfully balanced 4 plates up her arm before transferring them to the pass. 3 weeks into her job at Carter's, and her waitressing skills had improved from embarrassing to passable. "I had a good teacher," she replied, flashing a quick smile. Michael had taken time during his rare breaks to show her proper serving techniques. Saving her from Vera's constant criticism, she'd grown comfortable in her Lily persona, finding unexpected freedom in anonymity. Here, no one expected her to have all the answers or make perfect decisions. The staff had gradually accepted her as one of their own, sharing gossip and complaints during smoke breaks she joined but never actually smoked during. As Michael leaned forward to adjust the garnish on a plate, something slipped from beneath his chef's coat, a medallion on a simple silver chain. It caught the light, momentarily flashing golden before disappearing back under his collar. Lily froze, her hand halfway to the plate he'd just approved. Something about that medallion seemed achingly familiar. "Everything okay?" Michael asked, noticing her hesitation. "Fine," she said quickly, regaining her composure. "Just trying not to mess up these beautiful plates." Throughout her shift, Lily found herself watching Michael whenever possible. Twice more she caught glimpses of the chain around his neck, but never a clear view of the medallion itself. That night in her queen's apartment, Sarah, no longer Lily once she crossed the threshold, pulled out an old jewelry box she'd brought from her penthouse. Inside, nestled in black velvet, lay a medallion identical to the one she'd glimpsed on Michael. A seat, Christopher metal, heavy gold with intricate engraving and a small emerald embedded at the center. Her mother had given it to her when she turned 18, her voice unusually solemn. "This should have gone to someone else," Eleanor Montgomery had said. "Someone special, but now it's yours to keep safe." Sarah had never understood what her mother meant. She'd asked, of course, but Eleanor had changed the subject, her eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. After her parents' death, Sarah had packed the medallion away, too painful a reminder of questions never answered. Now, turning the medallion over in her hand, she noticed something she'd overlooked before. Tiny letters engraved on the back. Mem M. Not her initials. Not her father's either. She slipped the chain around her neck, tucking the medallion beneath her shirt. Its weight felt both foreign and familiar against her skin. "You ever notice how Catherine watches Michael?" Lisa whispered to Lily the next day as they folded napkins before the dinner rush. "What do you mean?" Lily asked. Genuinely curious, like she's seen a ghost or like she's afraid of him somehow. Lisa glanced around to ensure Vera wasn't within earshot. "It's creepy. She never looks directly at him, but she's always aware of him." Lily had noticed Catherine's strange behavior, but hadn't decoded it yet. Maybe she's afraid he'll quit. He's the reason this place has a Michelin star. Nah, it's something else. Been going on for years, according to Marco. Lisa referred to the bartender who'd worked at Carter's for over a decade. Started right after Michael got promoted to head chef. Something happened between them. Lily's curiosity deepened. An affair. It seemed unlikely given Michael's professional demeanor, But it would explain Catherine's furtive glances. Lisa snorted. With the Ice Queen? Doubt it. My money's on Michael knowing something she doesn't want getting out. The conversation ended as Vera appeared, barking orders about a last-minute party booking. But Lily filed away this new information, adding it to her mental dossier. That evening, Richard and Catherine hosted a dinner for potential investors. From her station, Lily could observe without being noticed. She watched Catherine throughout the meal, and indeed, the woman's gaze repeatedly drifted toward the open kitchen where Michael worked, her expression a complex mixture of apprehension and something else. Guilt, perhaps. More interesting still was Michael's medallion, which had slipped into view as he reached up to adjust a hanging copper pot. In the dining room's soft lighting, Lily couldn't be certain, but it appeared identical to the one currently hidden beneath her own server's uniform. As the night progressed, Lily found herself with a rare moment of downtime in the kitchen. Michael was alone at his station, meticulously plating a dessert. "Chef," she said, approaching cautiously. "I couldn't help noticing your medallion, St. Christopher, isn't it?" Michael's hand instinctively went to his chest, his expression guarded. "Yes, family heirloom of sorts. It's beautiful. I have a similar one," Lily said, testing the waters. "Mine has an emerald in the center." His hand stilled. "So does mine." Their eyes met, and for a moment something passed between them. A current of recognition neither could fully articulate. The moment shattered as the kitchen doors swung open and Catherine Carter swept in, her silk dress incongruous among the stainless steel and tile. She stopped short at the sight of them standing so close together. "I need to speak with Chef Winters," she announced, her voice brittle. "Alone?" Lily nodded deferentially and retreated, but not before catching the flash of alarm in Michael's eyes. Throughout the rest of her shift, Lily didn't see Michael again. Catherine stayed in the kitchen for nearly 20 minutes, and when she emerged, her usual perfect composure seemed slightly frayed. Michael remained behind, his face unusually pale, his movements mechanical as he returned to his work. The following day, Sarah took an enormous risk, under the guise of a scheduled video meeting with the board. She actually called Jessica from her Queens apartment. "How's my life going?" she asked, watching Jessica adjust the camera in the penthouse office. "Exhausting. How do you manage all these people demanding pieces of you?" Jessica looked tired but exhilarated by the challenge. "Your Aunt Margaret is getting suspicious, by the way. She keeps trying to schedule in-person meetings. Keep stalling her. I need more time." Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Can you do some discreet research for me? I need information on Michael Winters, head chef at Carter's." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "I thought Ethan was your target." "Ethan's a snake," Sarah said dismissively. "That mystery's solved, but there's something about Michael, and Catherine's reaction to him. It feels important. What am I looking for? His background? Primarily where he grew up, his connection to the Carters, and..." Sarah touched the hidden medallion beneath her shirt. "Any possible connection to my family?" Jessica looked puzzled but agreed. "I'll see what I can find. But Sarah, be careful. You've been undercover nearly a month. The longer this goes on." "I know the risks," Sarah interrupted. "I just need a little more time." After ending the call, Sarah opened her laptop to check her Montgomery Industries email, something she did sparingly to maintain her cover. Buried among routine messages was an alert from the automated system that monitored company finances. Several large transfers had been approved to offshore accounts she didn't recognize. Her first instinct was to call the CFO directly, but she caught herself. Sarah Montgomery wouldn't know about these transfers yet. Lily Adams certainly wouldn't. Instead, she made a note to have Jessica look into it. Something felt off, but she couldn't afford to blow her cover now. Not when she was getting closer to understanding the strange connection between Michael, his medallion, and Catherine Carter's guilty conscience. That night, Sarah lay awake in her modest apartment, the medallion clutched in her hand. She whispered to the darkness. "Who were you to my mother? And why does Michael Winters have your medallion?" Sleep eluded her as questions multiplied in her mind. Why did Catherine watch Michael with such apprehension? What was the true nature of the Carters' financial troubles? And how did it all connect to her? To the Montgomery legacy she'd spent her life upholding? Tomorrow, she decided, she would take another risk. She would find a way to see Michael's medallion up close, if it truly matched hers, if the same initials were engraved on the back. Then what? She didn't know, but for the first time since starting this charade, Sarah felt she was on the verge of discovering something far more significant than Ethan Carter's unsuitability as a husband, something that might shake the very foundations of everything she believed about herself and her family. The first alarm came via a text from Jessica. Urgent. Call me when you're alone. Sarah waited until her lunch break, ducking into the quiet alley behind Carter's restaurant. The spring air carried a hint of warmth, but goosebumps rose on her arms as she dialed Jessica's number. We have a problem, Jessica said without preamble. A big one. What's happened? Those transfers you flagged, they're just the tip of the iceberg. Someone's been systematically siphoning money from Montgomery accounts for nearly 2 years. Sarah pressed her back against the brick wall, her mind racing. How much? Based on what I can access without raising flags, at least 30 million so far. But there are patterns suggesting the total could be much higher, possibly approaching 60% of liquid assets. 60%? Sarah's voice rose before she caught herself, glancing around to ensure she was still alone. That's hundreds of millions. How is this possible? We have safeguards, multiple approvals required for large transfers. That's the concerning part, Jessica replied. Whoever's doing this has high-level access. They're using a sophisticated network of shell companies that all appear legitimate on paper. The transactions look like normal business operations, vendor payments, property acquisitions, development costs, but I traced several endpoints, and the money essentially disappears. Sarah closed her eyes. Piecing together the implications, when did this start? The earliest suspicious transaction I found was 22 months ago. The timing clicked into place. Right when Ryan Carter joined as my financial advisor, recommended by Ethan, approved by the board despite Sarah's initial hesitation. Ryan Carter, Ethan's cousin. Jessica sounded alarmed. Sarah, if the Carters are stealing from you, it explains their sudden interest in a marriage alliance, Sarah finished grimly. They're not just looking for a bailout, they're covering their tracks. The restaurant's back door opened. Startling Sarah, one of the line cooks emerged, lighting a cigarette. I have to go, she whispered. Keep digging, but carefully, and Jessica, don't trust anyone on the financial team right now. Throughout her afternoon shift, Sarah maintained Lily's meek demeanor while her mind worked furiously. If Ryan had stolen as much as Jessica suspected, the Montgomery empire was in genuine danger, yet she couldn't confront him without revealing her undercover operation and potentially losing the advantage of surprise. You look like you've seen a ghost, Michael commented as she collected an order from the pass. His eyes, always observant, studied her with concern. Just tired, she replied, forcing a smile. He didn't seem convinced, but nodded toward her tray. Table 7's getting impatient. As luck would have it, Table 7 held Ryan Carter himself, dining with 2 men in expensive suits. Men Sarah recognized from her own financial circles. The irony of serving lunch to the person systematically destroying her company wasn't lost on her. The salmon for you, sir, she said, placing the dish before Ryan. Studying his face as she did so, he barely glanced at her, continuing his conversation. The Montgomery portfolio is rock solid, he was saying, his smooth voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to lying. Sarah's brilliant with hotels. But she lets me handle the financial engineering. Between us, she's more interested in design elements than balance sheets. The men chuckled, and Sarah's hand tightened imperceptibly on the serving tray. Ryan Carter had never worked with her directly on a single balance sheet. Her CFO had complained about Ryan's insistence on inserting himself between departments. Streamlining communication, as he called it. Streamlining the path to theft, more like any progress on the engagement announcement, one of the men asked. Ryan smiled. We're aiming for next month. Ethan's got her representative practically eating out of his hand. You know how these things work. She thinks she's acquiring us, but really, the conversation shifted as they noticed Lily hovering. We need more water, Ryan said dismissively. Right away, sir. As Sarah retreated, her mind crystallized around a plan. She couldn't confront Ryan directly, but she could protect what remained of her assets. She had passwords and authorization codes that even Ryan couldn't access. emergency measures her father had established for worst-case scenarios. That evening, using the secure laptop she kept hidden in her queen's apartment, Sarah activated Protocol Safeguard, a contingency plan that would immediately freeze all major transactions, while simultaneously transferring significant funds to hidden accounts only a Montgomery could access. As she confirmed the final authorization, Sarah felt a cold resolve settle over her. The Carters had stolen from her, lied to her, and planned to use her in a sham marriage to cover their tracks. They would pay for that mistake. The next morning, Sarah's phone buzzed with another text from Jessica. "Board emergency meeting called. Ryan's freaking out. What did you do?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. "Protecting what's mine," she texted back. "Stall them. Say I'm having connection issues overseas." At Carter's, the atmosphere was tense. Richard and Ethan huddled in a corner booth, heads bent together over documents, their expressions thunderous. Ryan paced nearby, phone pressed to his ear, his usually impeccable appearance showing signs of strain. "Something big's happening," Lisa whispered, as she and Lily restocked the service station. "The Carters have been here since before opening, and they're scaring away the lunch crowd with those faces." Sarah nodded absently, straining to catch snippets of conversation from the Carter table. "Completely frozen," she heard Ryan hiss. "Every major account." "Fix it," Richard growled. "That's what we pay you for." "I'm trying, but these security protocols—" "I don't want excuses," Richard cut him off. "I want solutions. The West Side development payment is due Friday, and our creditors won't wait." "What about the Montgomery merger?" Ethan interjected. "Can we accelerate?" Ryan's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "Accelerate? We can barely maintain the illusion of solvency now. One look at our real books and she'll run screaming." "Then make sure she doesn't see the real books," Richard said coldly. "Isn't that what we've been paying you for all this time?" Sarah had heard enough. As she turned to walk away, she nearly collided with Catherine, who had approached silently from behind. "Eavesdropping, Lily." Catherine's voice was soft but dangerous. "No, ma'am, I'm sorry," Lily stammered, eyes downcast in appropriate deference. Catherine studied her for a long moment. "You've been working here, what, a month now?" "Yes, ma'am, almost exactly. Yet I hardly notice you. There's something forgettable about you." Her pale eyes narrowed slightly. "That's a useful quality in your position, I suppose." With that unsettling observation, Catherine glided away toward her family's table, leaving Sarah with a chill that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. That night, Sarah received another call from Jessica. "The board's in an uproar," Jessica reported. "Ryan tried to explain the freeze as a security upgrade, but no one's buying it. Margaret's demanding your return immediately." "What did you tell them?" "That you're on your way back from Tokyo." "I had to give them something, Sarah. This charade can't continue much longer." Sarah knew Jessica was right. Her undercover operation had yielded critical information: the Carters' true nature, their financial deception, and tantalizing hints about Michael and his connection to her past. But time was running out. "I need one more week," she said firmly. "There's something I have to understand about Michael before I return." "The chef, Sarah. Your company is in crisis. A crisis I've contained by securing our primary assets. Trust me." "Jessica, this is important." After ending the call, Sarah removed her medallion, turning it over to study the engraved initials. M. The same initials she'd glimpsed on Michael's medal during a rare moment when it had fallen completely free from his chef's coat. 2 identical medallions. 2 sets of the same initials. One mystery that seemed increasingly connected to Catherine Carter's guilty glances and secretive past. Tomorrow, Sarah decided, she would find a way to speak with Michael privately. The financial deception was clear now. Ryan had been systematically looting her company while the Carters planned to use a marriage to conceal their crimes. But the mystery of Michael and his medallion felt more personal, more profound. Despite the crisis engulfing her business empire, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that discovering the truth about Michael Winters might change everything she thought she knew about herself. Opportunity presented itself in an unlikely form. A private cooking class. Carters occasionally offered these exclusive sessions for wealthy patrons, taught by Michael himself, when a last-minute cancellation left the restaurant scrambling to fill spots. Sarah, as Lily, volunteered to help with setup and service. You sure? Vera asked suspiciously. It's after your regular hours. I could use the extra money, Lily replied with an appropriately eager smile. The class was scheduled for that evening after dinner service. While the restaurant buzzed with activity, Sarah slipped into the employee locker room and located Michael's locker. It wasn't difficult to find. His name was on a small plaque, a courtesy extended only to him as head chef. She hesitated, moral qualms surfacing despite the higher stakes involved. Breaking into someone's personal space crossed a line, but she needed answers, and time was running out. The lock was simple. She'd noticed Michael using a key rather than a combination. After ensuring she was alone, Sarah pulled out a small set of pics she'd acquired during this investigation, a skill she'd never imagined needing as a CEO, learned through an online tutorial during her second week as Lily. 30 seconds later, the locker swung open. Sarah worked quickly, rifling through the sparse contents. A change of clothes, a dog-eared cookbook, a small toiletry bag. Nothing revealing, nothing personal. Until her fingers brushed against something wedged at the back. A photograph. She pulled it out carefully. The image showed a much younger Michael beside an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. They stood in front of a modest house, Michael's arm protectively around the woman's shoulders. They looked happy, comfortable together. On the back, written in faded ink, Michael and Helen 2010. Helen. The name sparked no immediate recognition. Sarah carefully replaced the photo and closed the locker, her search yielding more questions than answers. The cooking class was intimate. Only 6 participants gathered around the demonstration kitchen. Michael moved with practiced ease, explaining techniques while his hands transformed simple ingredients into culinary art. Sarah watched from the periphery, ostensibly there to assist, actually studying his every movement. Chef needs more prepped herbs, another assistant whispered, nudging Sarah. She nodded and headed to the main kitchen, grateful for the excuse to explore. While gathering the requested herbs, Sarah noticed a shelf of cookbooks in Michael's office alcove. Reference materials, most looking well used. One in particular caught her eye. Traditional family recipes. It was older than the others, its spine cracked and mended multiple times. On impulse, Sarah pulled it from the shelf. A thin envelope slipped out, fluttering to the floor. She snatched it up, heart racing, and saw Michael, written on the front in spidery handwriting. Footsteps approached. Sarah quickly replaced the book and pocketed the envelope, returning to her herb gathering just as one of the line cooks entered. Lily, chef's asking for those herbs. Coming right up, she replied, her voice steadier than her hands. Later that night, safe in her queen's apartment, Sarah carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. My dear Michael, if you're reading this, I've finally passed on. Don't grieve too much. 92 years is plenty for anyone, and I've had a good life, especially the joy of raising you. There's something I should have told you years ago. Something about where you came from. I always meant to, but the right time never seemed to arrive, and then it felt too late to upend your world. The medallion you wear was around your neck the night I took you in. It matches another. One I glimpsed only once. Worn by a little girl. You weren't meant to be separated from her, but circumstances left me no choice. I've kept a diary all these years. You'll find it in the cedar box under my bed. Read it, Michael. It will explain everything I couldn't say in life. Whatever you discover, know that you've been loved every day since you came into my care. That's the truth that matters most. All my love. Helen. Sarah read the letter 3 times, her mind racing. Helen had raised Michael, but he wasn't her biological son. And there was a diary that might hold answers about the medallion, about Michael's origins, about the little girl mentioned in the letter. Could that girl have been? Sarah shook her head, unwilling to leap to conclusions without evidence. She needed to find that diary. Did you know Helen well? Lily asked Marco the bartender the next day, keeping her tone casual as they prepared for opening. Marco nodded solemnly. Everyone loved Helen. She practically raised Michael after his parents died. Or at least, that's what everyone thought until the funeral. What do you mean? Helen's neighbor mentioned something about Michael being her boy since that terrible night. Made it sound like she'd taken him in during some crisis, not that she was related to him. Marco shrugged. Michael never talked about it afterward. Just threw himself into work even more than usual. When did she pass away? About a year ago. Michael took a month off. Only time I've ever seen him away from this kitchen. Marco lowered his voice. Strangest thing, though. Catherine Carter attended the funeral. Sat in the back. Didn't speak to anyone. Left before the service ended. Sarah absorbed this information. Pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind. Do you know where Helen lived? Sure. Little place in Queens. Michael keeps it exactly as it was. Can't bring himself to sell it, I guess. Sarah's pulse quickened. The diary might still be there, waiting to be discovered. By midnight, Sarah had the address. A small row house in Sunnyside. Queens. Modest, but well-maintained according to the property record she'd accessed. She debated how to proceed. Breaking into Michael's locker was one thing. Breaking into a house was quite another. She decided on a more direct approach. The next morning, she arrived at the restaurant early, knowing Michael started prep hours before anyone else. Chef, she called softly, finding him alone in the kitchen, already working on stocks for the day. He looked up, surprise flashing across his face. Lily, you're not on the schedule until noon. I know, She hesitated, then reached beneath her shirt and pulled out her medallion, letting it catch the light. I need to talk to you about this, and about Helen. Michael froze, knife suspended over half-chopped vegetables. His eyes locked on the medallion, identical to his own. Where did you get that? His voice was barely audible. My mother gave it to me. She said it should have gone to someone else. Someone special. Sarah took a deep breath. I found the letter from Helen in your cookbook. I know about the diary. Color drained from Michael's face. For a moment, Sarah thought he might order her to leave. Instead, he set down his knife with deliberate care. Who are you really? He asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. This was the moment to reveal everything. To tell Michael that Lily Adams was a fiction, that she was Sarah Montgomery, CEO of a global corporation and target of the Carter family's schemes. Before she could speak, the kitchen door swung open. Catherine Carter stood there, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. Michael and Lily standing close together, medallions visible, tension palpable. What's going on here? Catherine's voice was sharp with alarm. Michael recovered first. Nothing that concerns you. Mrs. Carter, Lily was just asking about a recipe. Catherine's gaze flicked between them, suspicion evident. Before opening, how dedicated. Her eyes lingered on Sarah's medallion before she abruptly turned to Michael. My office now. After Catherine left, Michael quickly tucked his medallion back under his chef's coat. Meet me tonight. Helen's house. 8 o'clock. He scribbled the address on an order ticket and pressed it into her hand. Sarah nodded, slipping the paper into her pocket. Whatever Catherine wanted to discuss with Michael. It had to be connected to their shared past. The medallions had triggered something in Catherine. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. As she left the restaurant to kill time until her actual shift, Sarah felt both apprehension and anticipation. Tonight she would learn the truth about Helen, about Michael, and possibly about herself. The diary waited, and with it, answers to questions she hadn't even known to ask. Helen's house stood at the end of a quiet street in Sunnyside, a modest 2-story building with weathered red brick and neatly trimmed hedges. Sarah arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, her heart pounding with anticipation and uncertainty. The porch light cast a warm glow over the entrance, a silent invitation into the past. Michael opened the door before she could knock. He'd changed out of his chef's whites into jeans and a simple gray sweater, making him look younger, more vulnerable somehow. You came, he said, relief evident in his voice. I wasn't sure you would. I need answers, Sarah replied simply. He nodded, stepping aside to let her enter. Don't we all? The interior of Helen's home felt frozen in time. Floral patterned furniture, crocheted throws, and framed photographs covering every surface. It was clean but untouched, as though preserved as a museum to a life now ended. I haven't changed anything, Michael explained, following her gaze. Can't bring myself to. Sarah nodded, understanding loss in a way few others could. She meant a lot to you. Everything. His voice roughened with emotion. She was the only family I knew. They stood awkwardly in the living room, Two strangers connected by identical medallions and a mystery neither fully understood. "Catherine was upset after she saw us this morning," Michael finally said. "Demanded to know who you were, how long you'd worked at Carter's. When I told her you'd been there about a month, she looked scared." "Why would Catherine Carter be afraid of a waitress?" Sarah asked. Though she already suspected the answer had nothing to do with Lily Adams and everything to do with the medallion she wore, Michael's expression darkened. "That's what I'd like to know. She's been watching me for years, always keeping her distance but never letting me completely out of her sight. Helen used to say it was guilt. Guilt over what?" Instead of answering, Michael gestured toward the stairs. "The diary's upstairs. I think it's time we both read it." He led her to a small bedroom that had clearly been Helen's. Floral wallpaper, a neatly made single bed, and photographs of Michael at various ages covering the dresser. Kneeling beside the bed, Michael pulled out a worn cedar box. "I found this after she died, but I couldn't." He swallowed hard. "I couldn't bring myself to open it. Whatever secrets she kept, they were hers to tell when she was ready. And now I think we don't have a choice." He placed the box on the bed between them and opened the lid. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its edges frayed with age and use. Beside it was a yellowed newspaper clipping dated 40 years earlier. The headline made Sarah's breath catch. "Fire at Montgomery Estate. One feared dead." Michael unfolded the brittle paper carefully. A photograph showed smoke billowing from the east wing of what Sarah instantly recognized as her family's former estate in Westchester, the home where she'd spent her early childhood before her parents moved the family to Manhattan. "I don't understand," Michael said, staring at the photo. "What does this have to do with me? With us?" With trembling fingers, Sarah reached for the diary. "Let's find out." The journal began 39 years earlier. Helen had been a cook for the Montgomery family, writing about her joy in the position and her fondness for the family, especially the young twins, a boy and a girl just 6 months old. "Twins," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "My parents never mentioned a twin." Michael's expression mirrored her shock. "Keep reading." The entries continued chronologically, describing Helen's daily life at the estate. Then came the entry dated the night of the fire. "I cannot write this with steady hands, but I must record what happened while the horror is fresh. The nursery wing caught fire just after midnight. I was working late in the kitchen when I smelled the smoke. The nanny had the night off. No one should have been there except the children. I ran upstairs and found Catherine, that new girl they'd hired to help with housekeeping, coming out of the nursery with both babies. She looked terrified, soot on her face. When she saw me, she thrust the boy into my arms and said, 'Take him, I'll bring the girl.' The smoke was thickening, flames already licking the hallway. I ran with the boy, expecting Catherine to follow with the girl. But when I reached safety outside, she appeared empty-handed, screaming that the flames had forced her back, that the girl must still be inside, while others rushed to find the master and mistress. I noticed something strange. Catherine's coat seemed bulky. Moving slightly, I confronted her, and her eyes went wild. She admitted she'd planned to take both children, to demand money from the Montgomerys for their return. The fire wasn't an accident. She'd started it as a distraction, but in her panic, she realized she couldn't escape with 2 infants. She'd given me the boy only because she had no choice. Intending to disappear with the girl, I threatened to expose her. We struggled. The girl, sweet little Sarah, fell from Catherine's coat onto the ground, while I checked that the baby wasn't hurt. Catherine fled into the night. By then, everyone believed the boy had perished in the fire. Mrs. Montgomery collapsed when told one child was lost. I tried to explain, but in the chaos, with firemen everywhere, and Mrs. Montgomery sedated, only Mr. Montgomery seemed to understand what I was saying. He made a decision that will haunt me forever. "They can't know the truth now," he said, looking at his unconscious wife. "It would destroy her to think our son was stolen rather than lost to the fire. And if this woman, this Catherine, is truly gone, we may never find him." What could I do? The boy was pressed to my chest, his tiny fingers clutching my uniform. "Take care of him," Mr. Montgomery said, pressing money into my hand. "Give him a good life. Someday, when the time is right, we'll make this whole again." So I left, carrying a child who should have grown up in wealth and privilege, but who now had only me. I named him Michael, after my father. The only thing I kept from his former life was the medallion around his neck, the match to his sister's. Sarah's hands shook so violently that the diary slipped from her grasp. Michael caught it, his own face pale with shock. "This can't be real," he whispered. But the evidence was undeniable. The matching medallions, the timing, the unexplained connection they'd felt upon meeting. Sarah pulled out her phone, quickly searching her family history archive. There it was, Catherine's maiden name listed among household staff from 40 years ago. She married Richard Carter less than a year after the fire, Sarah said, her voice hollow with disbelief. She's been living in plain sight all these years, married to one of the most prominent businessmen in New York. And I've been working for her, cooking for her, never knowing she was the reason. Michael couldn't finish the sentence, his voice choked with emotion. Sarah looked up at him, truly seeing him for the first time. The shape of his eyes so like her father's, the determined set of his jaw that mirrored her own. Not just a stranger with a matching medallion. Her brother, her twin. She recognized you, Sarah realized aloud. That's why she kept you close all these years, hiring you despite everything. She needed to make sure you never discovered the truth. And why she panicked when she saw your medallion, Michael added. But why return to the family she'd wronged? Why marry into such a public life? Protection, Sarah suggested grimly. Who would suspect the wealthy Mrs. Carter of being a kidnapper and arsonist? They fell silent, overwhelmed by revelations too monumental to immediately process. 40 years of separation, 40 years of lies. My name, Michael finally said. My real name would have been Montgomery, Sarah finished softly. Michael Montgomery. She reached across the diary between them and took his hand. A brother's hand. Flesh and blood she hadn't known existed until this moment. I need to tell you something, she said, knowing the time for deception had passed. My name isn't Lily Adams. It's Sarah Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Industries. And as night deepened around Helen's preserved home, Sarah finally revealed the full truth of her disguise and her investigation of the Carters, a family that had wronged them both in ways neither could have imagined. Michael paced the length of Helen's small living room, his chef's hands restless as he processed Sarah's revelation. So, the woman I've been serving is the same one who's supposed to marry Ethan Carter, he said, still grappling with the layers of deception. And their family has been stealing from you while pushing for this merger. Yes. Sarah sat perched on the edge of Helen's floral sofa, her lily disguise feeling increasingly absurd in light of what they'd discovered. Ryan Carter, Ethan's cousin and my financial advisor, has been systematically looting my company for almost 2 years. And no one noticed. He was careful. Created a complex web of legitimate-looking transactions. She sighed, running a hand through her mousy brown hair, a physical reminder of her altered identity. I've secured what remains of our assets, but the damage is extensive. Michael stopped pacing, studying her with newfound recognition. Our assets, he repeated. That's going to take some getting used to. A tense silence fell between them. Siblings separated by 40 years of different lives, different worlds. The diary lay open on the coffee table, Helen's handwriting a bridge across the chasm of their separation. There's more, Sarah finally said, reaching for the diary again. Something our father did. She carefully turned to the pages dated a few years after the fire. Helen had recorded a secret visit from Edmund Montgomery, a meeting that had transpired while the rest of the household thought he was on a business trip. Mr. Montgomery came to see Michael today, the first time in 5 years. He watched the boy playing in the yard, tears in his eyes. He has his mother's smile, he said. She still grieves for him every day, though she's learned to hide it for Sarah's sake. I asked why he'd come after all this time. He showed me papers, a revised will he'd created without his lawyer's knowledge. Catherine vanished after that night, he explained. But people like her don't just disappear. Someday she might return, and I need to be prepared. He's left half of his personal fortune, separate from the company holdings, to Michael. Should he ever be found, the will is hidden where only a Montgomery would think to look for it. He wouldn't tell me where, only that it's hidden in plain sight, in the heart of what brought our family together. Before leaving, He gave me money for Michael's education and made me promise never to tell Eleanor about his visit. It would only reopen wounds, he said, until we can bring him home for good. This is better. I'm not sure I agree, but I gave my word. A hidden will, Michael said, his voice hushed with disbelief. A fortune neither Catherine nor Richard know exists. Sarah nodded slowly. My father was always cautious, kept personal assets separate from the company. I accessed those accounts directly, which is why Ryan couldn't touch them. But I had no idea there might be more. Hidden in plain sight, in the heart of what brought our family together, Michael repeated. What does that mean? Sarah stared at the diary, her mind racing through possibilities. Montgomery Industries began as a single hotel in Manhattan, the Montgomery Grand. My parents always said that's where they fell in love, working side by side to make it successful. The heart of what brought them together, Michael agreed. But where specifically, it's a massive building. The kitchen, Sarah said suddenly. My mother always told me they bonded over a shared love of cooking. My father was trained as a chef before becoming a hotelier. That passion is what made Montgomery hotels famous for their restaurants. Michael's eyes lit with understanding. The family recipes, he said. The cookbook I keep at Carter's. It belonged to your father, our father. Helen gave it to me when I started cooking professionally. The traditional recipe book, Sarah confirmed. I noticed it in your office. It can't be a coincidence, Michael said. Helen must have known the will was hidden there, but couldn't tell me directly because of her promise. Sarah grabbed her phone. I need to call Jessica, my friend who's been covering for me. She can get access to the hotel in the book. Michael shook his head. It's not the same book. The original is at Carter's. He glanced at his watch. The restaurant's closed now, but I have keys. A plan formed rapidly between them. A midnight expedition to retrieve the cookbook, and, hopefully, their father's hidden legacy. Carter's restaurant was eerily silent after hours. The dining room ghostly with chairs inverted atop tables. Michael disarmed the security system with practiced ease, leading Sarah through the darkened space toward the kitchen. Stay close, he whispered. The night cleaning crew comes through at 2. They moved efficiently through the kitchen to Michael's small office alcove. The cookbook sat exactly where Sarah had seen it earlier, worn and well-used, its spine reinforced with tape from decades of handling. Michael carefully lifted it from the shelf, an unexpected reverence in his movements. Helen would make dishes from this book every Sunday, said it was important I learn the recipes that had been in my family for generations. His voice caught. I never understood what she meant until now. He placed the book on his desk and began carefully examining it, checking the binding, flipping through pages, running his fingers along the edges. There, Sarah pointed to a slight bulge in the back cover. The binding looks different there. Michael nodded, and carefully worked a paring knife along the seam, revealing a hidden compartment crafted into the cover itself. From within, he extracted a folded document sealed with wax, an old-fashioned touch that had protected it from discovery all these years. The seal bore the Montgomery family crest. This is it, Sarah whispered. Before Michael could break the seal, a noise from the dining room froze them both. Footsteps, too deliberate for the cleaning crew. Someone's here, Michael mouthed, quickly pocketing the document and replacing the book on the shelf. They crept toward the kitchen doors, peering through the small windows. Richard and Catherine Carter stood in the dimly lit dining room, engaged in tense conversation. Completely unacceptable, Richard was saying. Ryan assures me our access will be restored once the marriage contract is signed. It's too risky, Catherine replied, her voice tight with anxiety. I told you this Montgomery merger was a mistake. We should have stayed away from that family entirely. A bit late for those concerns, Richard sneered. 40 years too late, in fact. Catherine's face paled. What are you talking about? Richard laughed without humor. Did you think I never knew? About the fire. About what you did before I met you. Sarah and Michael exchanged shocked glances. Richard had known all along. I don't, Catherine began. Save it. Richard cut her off. I've always known who you were. The desperate housemaid who tried to kidnap the Montgomery twins for ransom. The one who started a fire that supposedly killed the boy. Catherine seemed to shrink before their eyes. How long have you known? Since before I married you, Richard said coldly. Edmund Montgomery was more connected than you realized. when he learned you were dating me. He came to warn me away, told me everything. Then why? Why marry you? Richard's smile was predatory. Because it gave me leverage over one of my biggest competitors. I kept your secret. In exchange, Montgomery hotels never expanded into certain markets where Carter properties flourished. Sarah felt her breath catch. Her father had handicapped his own business to protect Catherine's secret, to keep open the possibility of someday finding his son. And now, Catherine asked, her voice barely audible, now we're in too deep. If Sarah Montgomery discovers what we've done, what Ryan's done with her money, what you did to her family, we're finished. Richard straightened his tie with practiced precision. The engagement announcement is in 3 days. Once the contracts are signed, Ryan can begin untangling the financial web he's created. No one need ever know. Sarah had heard enough. She pulled out her phone and pressed record, capturing Richard's damning confession. Michael's hand closed over hers, a silent gesture of support as they witnessed the final unraveling of decades of deception. When the Carters finally left, Sarah and Michael emerged from their hiding place, the sealed document still secure in Michael's pocket. They know nothing about the will, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Or about you being alive. Michael nodded grimly. But they will soon. He broke the seal on the document, carefully unfolding the brittle paper. Together, they read Edmund Montgomery's final wishes, a fortune set aside for my son, Michael Montgomery, separated but never forgotten. The details were specific, the legal language precise despite being drafted without attorneys. He never gave up hope, Michael said softly, touching the signature at the bottom. Our father never stopped looking for a way to make things right. Sarah squeezed his hand. And now we will. The engagement announcement is in 3 days. That gives us just enough time to prepare our own announcement. The grand ballroom of the Montgomery Plaza Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes. New York's elite mingled throughout the space, their designer clothes and rare jewelry creating a kaleidoscope of wealth. The event, officially billed as a special announcement by the Montgomery and Carter families, had drawn curious speculation from the business world and society pages alike. You're certain about this? Jessica asked, adjusting Sarah's emerald earrings. After 6 weeks as Lily, Sarah had reclaimed her true appearance, her dark hair restored to its natural glory, her designer gown a far cry from Lily's humble wardrobe. More certain than I've been about anything, Sarah replied, touching the Christopher medallion now prominently displayed at her throat. We've tripled security, recorded everything, and secured all remaining assets. The Carters won't know what hit them. Jessica nodded, concern still evident in her eyes. And Michael, is he ready for this? Sarah glanced across the room where Michael stood near a service entrance, unrecognizable in a perfectly tailored suit. His chef's whites and casual demeanor had been replaced by the confident bearing of a Montgomery heir. The family resemblance, now that they knew to look for it, was unmistakable. He's been ready for 40 years, Sarah said softly. He just didn't know it. The orchestra struck up a welcome fanfare as Richard and Catherine Carter entered with Ethan and Ryan flanking them. The perfect picture of family success, Sarah thought bitterly, knowing the rot that lay beneath the polished surface. Ethan's eyes immediately found Sarah across the room, a predatory smile forming as he took in her transformation from the photos he'd seen. He hadn't yet realized that his prey had become the hunter. Aunt Margaret approached, resplendent in midnight blue and diamonds. You've caused quite a stir with your sudden return and this mysterious announcement, she said, kissing Sarah's cheek. The board is anxious. They won't be disappointed, Sarah assured her, squeezing her aunt's hand. Everything I've done has been to protect our family legacy. Margaret studied her niece carefully. You've changed. There's something different about you. Sarah smiled. Clarity, perhaps. A subtle signal from the security team indicated the final preparations were complete. Sarah excused herself and made her way to the small stage where a podium awaited. The room quieted as she took her position, every eye drawn to the commanding presence of Sarah Montgomery in her element. Good evening, she began, her voice carrying effortlessly across the hushed space. Thank you all for joining what the invitation promised would be a special announcement between the Montgomery and Carter families. She paused, her gaze finding Ethan's smug face in the crowd. He raised his champagne flute slightly, a toast to their impending engagement. Beside him, Ryan checked his phone nervously, no doubt still trying to figure out why their access to Montgomery accounts remained frozen. "Many of you have speculated this would be an engagement announcement," Sarah continued. "The joining of two prestigious family dynasties." Catherine Carter's tight smile didn't reach her eyes. She clutched Richard's arm with white-knuckled fingers, her gaze darting around the room as if sensing a trap. "This is indeed about family," Sarah said, her tone shifting, "but not in the way you might expect." She touched her medallion. "This Sat, Christopher medal, has been in my family for generations. My mother gave it to me when I turned 18, telling me it should have gone to someone else, someone special. For years, I never understood what she meant." The room remained captivated, though confusion was evident on many faces. Sarah noticed Aunt Margaret leaning forward, her expression suddenly alert. "6 weeks ago, I began an investigation into the Carter family before committing to any marriage alliance. What I discovered was far more than financial impropriety or character flaws." Sarah's voice hardened. "I discovered the truth about a fire at the Montgomery estate 40 years ago. A fire deliberately set by someone who had planned to kidnap 2 infants, twins, and hold them for ransom." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Catherine Carter swayed slightly, Richard's arm the only thing keeping her upright. That person panicked, fleeing with only one child, the girl. While the boy was saved by a loyal family employee, the world was told the boy had perished in the fire. But that was a lie. Sarah paused, letting the moment stretch. That boy survived. He grew up not knowing his true identity, raised by the woman who saved him. The murmurs grew louder. Catherine's face had gone deathly pale. "Tonight, I would like to introduce you to someone." Sarah extended her hand toward the side of the room. "My brother, Michael Montgomery." Michael stepped forward into the spotlight, the identical St. Christopher medallion gleaming at his throat. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom as he joined Sarah at the podium, their family resemblance now unmistakable under the bright lights. "The Carters have known this truth for 40 years, Sarah continued, her voice ringing with controlled anger. "Richard Carter married Catherine knowing she had attempted to kidnap the Montgomery heirs. He used this knowledge to pressure my father into business concessions for decades." Security personnel had quietly moved to block the main exits. On the screens around the ballroom, documents appeared. Financial records, the hidden will, Helen's diary entries, and the recorded conversation between Richard and Catherine from the restaurant. Furthermore, under Ryan Carter's financial guidance, nearly 60% of Montgomery liquid assets have been systematically diverted through shell companies over the past 2 years. Sarah gestured to where Ryan stood frozen in place, all part of a plan to cripple Montgomery Industries before rescuing it through a marriage alliance. Ryan made a sudden move toward a side exit, but was intercepted by waiting security guards. "The authorities have been provided with complete documentation of these crimes," Michael said, speaking publicly as a Montgomery for the first time. "Federal investigators are currently seizing Carter properties and accounts pending a full investigation." Richard Carter pushed forward through the stunned crowd. "This is preposterous. You have no proof." "We have every proof," Sarah cut him off coldly, "including your own recorded confession about Catherine's crimes and your knowledge of them. Did you really think you could steal from a Montgomery and get away with it? And did you think I wouldn't recognize my own son?" Eleanor Montgomery's voice rang out as she entered from a side door. Supported by Margaret, though frail at 75, Eleanor's eyes blazed with a mother's fierce recognition. As she beheld Michael for the first time in 40 years, Michael's composed demeanor cracked at the sight of the mother he'd never known. Sarah took his hand, grounding him as Eleanor approached. "My boy," Eleanor whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "My missing heart." The room fell silent as mother and son embraced, 4 decades of separation dissolving in a moment of recognition that transcended time and deception. In the stunned silence that followed, Ethan Carter attempted to salvage something from the wreckage. "Sarah, surely we can discuss this privately. Whatever my family may have done, I had no knowledge." "Save it, Ethan," Sarah said, without looking at him. "We have recordings of you discussing exactly how you plan to use Montgomery money to pay off your gambling debts and maintain your multiple affairs after our marriage." Federal agents were now visible at the ballroom entrances, moving purposefully toward the Carter family. Catherine seemed to collapse inward on herself, decades of deception finally catching up in a moment of public reckoning. Richard Carter, Catherine Carter, Ryan Carter, and Ethan Carter, announced the lead agent, his voice cutting through the murmurs. You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, embezzlement, kidnapping, and arson. You have the right to remain silent. As the agents led the Carter family away, Sarah addressed the shocked guests one final time. Montgomery Industries will be restructured under joint leadership, myself and my brother Michael. Finally reunited after 40 years of separation, she smiled at Eleanor, who hadn't let go of Michael's hand. Our family is whole again, and that is the true announcement worth celebrating tonight. Champagne flowed as the orchestra resumed playing, the stunned crowd gradually processing the night's revelations. In a quiet corner, Eleanor, Margaret, Sarah, and Michael formed a tight circle, a family broken by fire and deception, now forged anew in truth and justice. 1 year later, the kitchen of the newly opened Heritage restaurant hummed with purposeful activity. Michael moved through the space with the same quiet authority he'd always possessed, but there was an ease to his movements now, a contentment that hadn't existed during his years at Carter's. First seating's nearly full, he told Sarah as she entered through the staff entrance. The critics from the Times and New Yorker are both here. Sarah smiled, adjusting her simple yet elegant blazer. Let them come. We've nothing to hide anymore. The journey to this moment had been both challenging and transformative. After the Carters' dramatic downfall splashed across every newspaper and business publication in the country, the siblings had faced the daunting task of rebuilding the Montgomery empire while integrating their vastly different lives and talents. The legal aftermath had unfolded largely as expected. Catherine, facing the most serious charges due to the kidnapping and arson, had accepted a plea deal that acknowledged her advanced age. She would serve a reduced sentence of 7 years, followed by supervised release. In a move that surprised many, she had offered a full confession once in custody, seemingly relieved to finally unburden herself. After decades of living with her crimes, Richard had fought the charges more vigorously, but ultimately received 15 years for his role in the financial crimes and for harboring knowledge of Catherine's actions. The judge had been particularly severe in his sentencing, citing Richard's calculated use of Catherine's vulnerability for his own financial gain. Ryan's financial expertise had worked against him during the trial. The prosecution had demonstrated that his intricate schemes required sophisticated knowledge and deliberate intent, resulting in a 20-year sentence for fraud and embezzlement. Ethan had received the lightest sentence, 5 years for his role in the conspiracy. His limited involvement in the financial crimes, coupled with a dramatic courtroom apology, had earned him some leniency. Mother's already at table 9 with her friends, Michael said, bringing Sarah back to the present. She's showing off the medallions display again. Sarah glanced toward the dining room where Eleanor Montgomery sat surrounded by her oldest friends, gesturing animatedly toward the wall where the original Saint Christopher medallions, now joined by the hidden will and Helen's diary, were displayed in a custom case. After decades of grief, Eleanor had emerged from her shell, embracing life with renewed vigor as she built a relationship with her long-lost son. She's happier than I've ever seen her, Sarah observed softly. We all are, Michael replied. Who would have thought a forced marriage proposal would lead to all this? Heritage had been their joint inspiration, a chain of accessible restaurants built around the recipes in their father's cookbook, offering exceptional food at prices that made fine dining experiences available to a wider audience. The original Montgomery medallions were displayed prominently in each location, a symbol of the family's redemption and rebirth, but their partnership extended beyond restaurants. Montgomery Industries had been restructured, combining Sarah's business acumen with Michael's understanding of hospitality from the ground up. Together, they had created the Helen Foundation, named for the woman who had saved and raised Michael, offering educational opportunities and career development for disadvantaged youth interested in hospitality careers. The new apprentices start next week, Sarah said, checking her tablet. 20 of them, including 3 from the juvenile rehabilitation program. Michael nodded approvingly. I've asked Marco to help mentor them. He has a way of connecting with the kids no one else believes in. Marco, the former bartender from Carter's, had been one of the first employees they'd hired after the Carter properties were liquidated in the wake of the scandal. Many of the staff had found themselves suddenly unemployed through no fault of their own. The Montgomery siblings had made it a priority to create positions for as many as possible. "Have you seen the latest application?" Sarah asked, sliding a folder across the counter. Michael raised an eyebrow as he read the name. "Ethan Carter. He's out already. Good behavior and overcrowding, released last month." Sarah watched her brother's reaction carefully. "He's applying for the lowest position we have. Dishwasher. Says he wants to learn the business from the ground up after he completes his community service hours." Michael was quiet for a long moment, his chef's hands perfectly still on the application. "What do you think?" "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that Helen would say everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even a Carter." A small smile touched Michael's lips. She would say exactly that. He signed the application and handed it back. "Let's see if he's sincere. Kitchen work has a way of revealing true character." Through the kitchen window, Sarah could see Jessica arriving with her husband, waving to Eleanor before being shown to their regular table. Beside Jessica walked James Warner, the architect who had redesigned all the heritage locations. Sarah felt a familiar warmth at the sight of him. Their relationship had developed gradually over months of working together, his quiet strength and creativity complementing her own drive in unexpected ways. "You should join them," Michael suggested, noting her gaze. "The kitchen can handle things here." "You're sure?" "Positive. Besides, you've been working nonstop on the Singapore expansion. Take an evening off." As Sarah moved toward the dining room, Michael called after her. "Did you hear about Catherine?" She turned back. "What about her?" "She's volunteering with the prison literacy program, teaching older inmates to read." He shook his head slightly. "The warden says she's actually quite good at it." Sarah absorbed this information, thinking of the bitter, guilt-ridden woman who had hidden her crimes for decades. "People can change, I suppose." "We certainly have," Michael replied. It was true. The Sarah of a year ago, isolated, suspicious, buried in work, would hardly recognize herself now. The disguise of Lily Adams had revealed parts of herself she hadn't known existed, a capacity for human connection, for seeing beyond hierarchy and status to the value in every person. Michael, too, had transformed, from a solitary chef defined by his work to a man embracing his newfound family, while using his talents and position to create opportunities for others. As Sarah joined James at the table, accepting his warm kiss on her cheek, she glanced back at the kitchen where Michael was now focused on plating a complex dessert, his concentration absolute. Beyond him, she could see the heritage wall where the medallions gleamed under carefully positioned lights, symbols of a family torn apart and miraculously reunited. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael's ex-wife Claire, confirming dinner plans for the weekend. After years of separation, they had tentatively begun rebuilding their relationship, brought closer by the extraordinary events of the past year and a new understanding of what truly mattered. "Everything okay?" James asked, noticing her momentary distraction. Sarah smiled, truly smiled, in a way that once would have felt foreign to her. "Better than okay," she assured him, tucking away her phone. "Everything is exactly as it should be." In the kitchen, Michael put the finishing touches on the dessert bearing Helen's name. A simple yet elegant creation, based on a recipe she had made every Sunday throughout his childhood. As he watched the server carry it out to the dining room, he touched the medallion at his throat, no longer hidden beneath chef's whites but displayed proudly for all to see. The circle was complete. What had begun with a simple disguise had led to the unmasking of decades of deception, the healing of old wounds, and the creation of something new and profoundly good from the ashes of the past. Michael caught Sarah's eye across the busy restaurant, and they shared a silent moment of understanding. The Montgomery legacy wasn't just about hotels or restaurants or foundations. It was about family, lost and found, broken and mended, stronger now than ever before.